Hey everyone. So, on the last day of Pride Month this year, I wanted to share an excerpt from How Sweet It Is that has been kind of on my mind. This is an excerpt from chapter 11. And just to set things up a little bit. So, this is a scene between Jackson and a character named Big Ed. So, in the chapter before this, Jackson and Rick, who are our two main characters, they take their first vacation together as a couple, and they decide to go to Key West. And they go to this restaurant, and Rick, if you haven't watched the videos and you're not really familiar, Rick is a truck driver from Ohio and has a lot of internalized homophobia. Like he's accepted his own sexuality, but he's very uncomfortable around people who are more comfortable displaying their queerness. So Rick and Jackson go to this restaurant in Key West, and the host, the waiter, Big Ed, who is this very flamboyant, wears a caftan. Until we learn his name, he's described as the man in the caftan. He is this product of another era. I envision this character. He was probably born in the 1930s. This scene, by the way, takes place in November of 2001. So he was born probably in the 1930s, lived through Stonewall, was probably at Stonewall in 1969. Probably was banished by his family, not accepted, and kind of had to find his own community, and has very much become who he is as a result of his circumstances. So he is this very demonstrative, over-the-top, but real person, and very accurate to a lot of gay men of that particular vintage who had a similar experience. You encounter these people, or at least back in the day, you tended to encounter these people in San Francisco or Provincetown or Key West, communities that were and are very, very accepting of who you are. And in fact, I named Big Ed after a character who was named Big Ed, who was a fixture in the Provincetown scene in the 1980s. Some of the things he says are things that I have been told the real Big Ed said. And if that real Big Ed is still alive, he would be probably close to 100 years old now. But if I recall correctly, he has been passed away for a long time now. So this was also sort of my tribute to that character and that kind of people of that generation. And I always imagined Harvey Fierstein playing this role. Like in the movie, Harvey Fierstein would play this role. So anyway, what has happened in the previous scene is that Rick and Jackson go to this restaurant, and Big Ed is the one working the floor, and he is being his fantastic, unfiltered self. Everything is a quip, and everything is an innuendo. Reciting the specials is an innuendo. It's very funny. He can turn anything into an innuendo. And he sees Rick and Jackson, and he is very demonstrative in kind of playing with Jackson and kind of flirting with him and making all these very loud quips for the entire restaurant to hear. And Jackson takes it in stride, but Rick does not, to say the least. And Rick explodes in a very ugly display of internalized homophobia and calls Big Ed, quote, a bitter old faggot. And they get kicked out of the restaurant. So Jackson and Rick have this argument afterwards, and they at least come to terms. But then the next day, Jackson decides that he needs to go apologize to Big Ed on Rick's behalf. So that's what this chapter is, or this excerpt is from chapter 11. And in the movie version, as I said, I envision Harvey Fierstein playing Big Ed, but this scene would almost certainly not be in the movie version just for pacing. It would completely slow down the pacing of the movie. But I love the idea of what happens in here, so I'm going to read it. And this is the first draft, so it is rough. There are turns of phrases that are clunky that I will rework, but it is rough. And again, this scene takes place in November of 2001. And the attitude, the optimism that Big Ed has is definitely in line with how someone of his generation would have felt in 2001. So it might feel a little bit quaint now, and especially with the Supreme Court ruling and what could be next. There's another resonance to this now that wasn't there even when I wrote this earlier this year. So just take that in mind, that this is at least accurate to how some people would have felt in 2001. But I wanted to share it today. So here we go. This is the first part of chapter 11 of How Sweet It Is. Jackson apologized to Big Ed the next day. While window shopping the novelty stores and boutiques with Rick, he was able to make a surreptitious escape to make his way down to the restaurant without arousing Rick's suspicion. Jackson knew he couldn't let Rick on to his wish to return to the scene of the outburst, no matter how pure his intentions, for Rick would dismiss the notion and successfully persuade Jackson to drop the matter entirely, convincing him to let bygones be bygones. This was something that Jackson knew he needed to do on his own, without Rick's advance knowledge. So while they strolled the promenade of downtown Main Street, Jackson excused himself from Rick while they were in one of those tacky tourist traps that specialized in seaside memorabilia, claiming he would secure dinner reservations at a seafood restaurant on the pier. Once escaped, Jackson dashed down the main thoroughfare, sprinting along with an urgency as if to eliminate Rick's suspicion caused by the amount of time taken to complete his task. He breathlessly opened the double doors that fronted Mallory Square and entered the vestibule, where he caught his breath and awaited his chance to see Big Ed. The lobby was empty, and, for a moment, it was unclear whether Big Ed was even working the floor that night. Jackson settled down on one of the velour-upholstered chaises and collected his mind for what he was about to say. After a momentary discussion overheard within the dining room, Big Ed appeared, a different brightly colored caftan draping his broad-bodied frame and flowing down like a satin waterfall. He perused the reservations list at the host stand before he spied Jackson seated on the chaise across the lobby. "Well, how do you do, young man?" Big Ed greeted, with no communicated recollection of the previous night's events. "Big Ed?" Jackson approached hesitantly, as if summoning his voice and questioning the name. "I am Big Ed," he replied, "but don't you get your panties in a wad. The size will surely disappoint you." Jackson chuckled silently while Big Ed made about checking the guest list. Jackson summoned up his voice and halted him with an entreaty that beckoned his attention back to his pretty face on the bench. "I wanted to talk to you for a minute, if that's okay," Jackson said, his voice confident if still questioning. "Dear heart, I have all the time in the world." Big Ed looked up from his reservation book and focused his eyes on Jackson. "I wanted to come in here to apologize to you on behalf of my friend." "Ah," Big Ed acknowledged, his eyebrows raising in instant recognition. Your friend, who's so resolutely shied me with his words, Jackson nodded. And while we're at it, are we talking a friend or euphemism friend? Neither, Jackson replied. I don't think of him as a euphemism, and he's so much more than a friend. I don't know what we call it. Lover, partner, business associate, Big Ed prompted suggestively. Jackson laughed and shrugged off the notion, pressing himself on to complete his intended purpose. I just mean, I'm really sorry for the things my friend said. Rick said, he clarified. I never took any offense to anything you said to me. I know you only meant it in good fun. But even if I did take offense, that wasn't no excuse for the things he said to you. And I wanted to come here today and apologize to your face because, I just felt terrible and I wanted to do you right. Big Ed moved over and took a seat beside Jackson. You wanted to do me right, Big Ed repeated, without irony or rancor. You were feeling bad, and you wanted to apologize to me because you wanted to do me right. There was no bitterness in his voice, only the sounds of someone searching for comprehension. After a moment of thoughtful reflection, he added, So I just have to ask, why are you the one apologizing and not your friend? As Jackson took a breath before starting in to answer, Big Ed cut in. You don't have to answer that. That wasn't charitable of me. I understand why your friend didn't want to apologize. And frankly, I can't blame him. He's hardly the first person to say those words to me. And I've heard worse. Far worse. What your friend said, the invective with which he hurled those words last night, I can't say it was undeserved. I did get carried away, dear heart, and I am not above admitting my transgressions. Seeing you two together sent me back years and years, back to my youth, he said with significance. My distant youth, you understand. A time long gone, with friends, most of them also long gone. Seeing you two together, seeing you happy in love together, stirred an excitement within me that I hadn't permitted myself to feel in a long time. And I forget sometimes that not everyone, most people in fact, are not so receptive to my particular little je ne sais quoi. I'm afraid that I did behave most inappropriately. And for that, I am truly, truly sorry. Big Ed lowered his head in momentary atonement while Jackson looked on kindly. I appreciate that, Jackson said, his words lifting Big Ed's head from his penitent bow. I know that folks your age are different. You have so much right there at your fingertips that my people never even dreamed of. We couldn't dream it, because back then it wasn't even possible. Jackson nodded and silently reflected, listening and allowing the lived wisdom of Big Ed to soak into his heart and soul. There's still a long way to go, make no mistake about that, Big Ed added. But change is coming. Something tells me a change is going to come. It will happen slowly. It always does. But there will come a day when you'll look back on what Vermont just passed this year, and it will seem like small potatoes.
But today, Vermont is leading the way. That's how progress happens. Slowly, too slowly. But be patient and keep fighting the good fight, and it will happen.
Big Ed reflected for a moment.
I hope you and your friend will be able to enjoy the progress that my friends and I were never able to dream of. I mean that sincerely. I wish my friends, your forefathers, would have been able to see it. But, to borrow the eloquent words as your friend so delicately put it, there are not enough fags my age. That's no excuse, mind you. Please don't ever think that I am using that as an excuse for any of my untowardly behavior. I am sharing it merely as a guide, a reference, if you will, to help you try to understand the milieu from which I have learned to operate. It is no excuse. I am truly, truly sorry.
In the silence that lingered underneath the weight of Big Ed's admission, Jackson took Big Ed's hand as if magnetically drawn to it by some indescribable force. He locked his eyes squarely on Big Ed's and spoke calmly and patiently. I'm so sorry for all the loss, Jackson said, struggling for the word. All the loss that you have known. I can't imagine losing so many people. What you had to go through, what your whole generation had to go through, I can't even imagine.
There is one thing you can do, Big Ed entreated after a silence.
What's that? Jackson asked.
You can live. You and your friend can make it up to all those before you by living your best life. Drink too much, get fucking hammered, tear each other down if you have to. But make up at the end of the day. Never go to bed angry. You and your friend have your whole life ahead of you to fight and make up. See the world, be crazy together, have amazing fucking sex, and love every minute of it. You live your best life, and don't waste time denying yourself the joy that so many before you never had the chance to enjoy.
Jackson swallowed and nodded. I'll do that.
I'll hold you to it.
Big Ed rose from his seat, Jackson following suit beside him.
Tell your friend I'm sorry from the bottom of my heart, if you think he will listen. If not, I still forgive him either way, whether he ever knows it or not.
Jackson and Big Ed held a conciliatory embrace, which ended with Big Ed offering a reassuring pat on the back that was just as much in comfort to Jackson as it was for himself, before sending him out on his way into the impending setting sun over the promontory of Mallory Square. And that was that little excerpt. Thank you for listening. Happy last day of Pride.